"Daddy, please don't get mad," she whispered, her voice barely a sound, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I didn't want to make things worse for you." Daniel Carter stood in that cafeteria doorway. 7-year-old Olivia, on her knees, picking up scattered food with her bare hands, while a group of kids laughed behind her back, and something inside him cracked clean through. Not broke. Cracked. The kind of break that doesn't make noise but goes all the way down to the bone and never fully closes again. If you've ever watched someone you love hurting while there was nothing you could do, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel right now. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with us all the way to the end. You will not regret it. Daniel Carter was not a man who cried easily. 42 years of hard living had made sure of that. 42 years of engine grease under his fingernails, of heat and noise, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from building something with your hands every single day. 42 years that included burying a wife he loved more than he had words for, raising a daughter alone in a desert town that didn't always make it easy, and wearing a cut on his back that told the world exactly who he was and exactly who stood beside him. He wasn't a man who cried, but standing in the doorway of Emerson Elementary School's cafeteria on a Tuesday afternoon in October, holding a paper bag with a turkey and Swiss sandwich cut diagonally the way Olivia liked it, Daniel Carter felt something move through his chest that had no name except grief. His daughter was on the floor, not sitting, not playing, on her knees on the linoleum, her small hands moving quietly across the floor, picking up pieces of food one by one and placing them back onto a cracked plastic tray. Her hair had fallen forward across her face. Her sweater, the yellow one, with the small white flowers she'd picked out herself 3 weeks ago, had a dark stain across the front that she'd clearly tried to rub away and failed. Her shoulders were curved inward, like she was trying to make herself smaller. Like she had been practicing making herself smaller for a long, long time. About 8 feet away, 3 boys were laughing. Not the careless laughter of kids distracted by something funny. The deliberate laughter of boys who knew exactly what they were doing and had learned, somewhere along the way, that nobody was going to stop them. One of them, big for his age, jacket with a sports team logo, hair gelled back like a kid who'd seen someone older do it and copied it, was nudging the one beside him and nodding on toward Olivia with a smirk that Daniel recognized instantly. He had seen that smirk on grown men before. It was the smirk of someone who had never once been held accountable for anything. At the lunch monitor station near the far wall, a woman in her 50s was eating her own sandwich and scrolling something on her phone. A younger aide had her back turned, reorganizing a cart of napkin dispensers. Neither of them was looking at the floor. Neither of them was looking at Olivia. Daniel stood in that doorway for 4 full seconds. He counted them later, in the silence of the drive home, because those 4 seconds felt important. 4 seconds where he assessed the situation the way men who've spent time in complicated environments learn to assess things quickly, thoroughly, and without the luxury of pretending he hadn't seen what he'd seen. Then he walked into the cafeteria. He didn't run, didn't shout, didn't do the thing his body was demanding he do, which involved none of the principles of measured response or mature parenting. He walked steady, deliberate, the kind of walk that had cleared space for him in rooms before without a single word being spoken. The lunch monitor looked up from her phone when she heard the door, clocked his cut, his build, his expression, and sat up very straight very quickly. He didn't look at her. He crossed the cafeteria floor and crouched down beside his daughter. Up close, it was worse. Olivia's hands were trembling. Not shaking dramatically, just that fine, persistent tremor that comes from holding tension in your body for too long. Her eyes were down. She was so focused on picking up the scattered food that she didn't register him for a full 2 seconds. And when she finally looked up and saw his face, something happened in her expression that destroyed him completely. She didn't look relieved. She looked afraid. Not afraid of him, he understood that distinction and held on to it, but afraid of the situation. Afraid of what his presence might mean. Afraid of what might happen next. And underneath that fear, layered beneath it like sediment, something that looked like shame so deep it had become familiar. "Daddy," she breathed. "Hey, sweetheart." His voice came out steadier than he expected. "I brought your sandwich." She blinked. Her mouth opened and closed. Then, very quietly, in a voice that broke the last intact thing in his chest, "Daddy, please don't get mad. I didn't want to make things worse for you." He set the paper bag down on the floor beside her. He reached out and tucked her hair back from her face so he could see her eyes. He took a slow breath. "Look at me, Livy." She looked at him. "Nothing that happened here today," he said, measuring every word, "is your fault. You understand me?" Her chin wobbled. She pressed her lips together hard, the way she'd always done since she was 3 when she was trying not to cry. And he recognized the gesture so viscerally that his throat closed around whatever else he'd been about to say. She nodded once, small and uncertain. "Good." He picked up the tray. He stood up. He held out his other hand to her. She took it. He didn't look at the boys, who were now conspicuously quiet. He didn't look at the lunch monitor, who had materialized at his elbow, with a nervous energy he could feel without turning around. He walked his daughter to an empty table, sat down across from her, opened the paper bag, and put her sandwich in front of her. "Eat," he said gently. "I'm right here." She ate. He watched her, and he filed everything away: the boy's face, the jacket, the gelled hair, the 2 adults who had been present and useless, and he kept his expression neutral and his voice calm, because Olivia was watching him the way she always watched him when she was trying to decide how scared to be. And he was not going to be another source of fear in her life. Not today, not ever. But in the private back room of himself, something had woken up, something old and patient and very, very certain. He called the school principal from the parking lot while Olivia waited in the truck. Principal Margaret Harlow picked up on the 3rd ring with the smooth, practiced tone of a woman who had handled upset parents before and had a system for it. "Mr. Carter," she said, before he'd identified himself caller ID. He noted, which meant his name was already in a certain kind of database. "I heard you came by during lunch. I want you to know we take all parental concerns very seriously, Mrs. Harlow." He kept his voice even. "My daughter was on the floor of your cafeteria picking up food that someone knocked off her tray. 2 of your staff were in the room. Neither one of them did anything." A pause. Brief but telling. These situations can sometimes be difficult to observe in real time. "She had a stain on her sweater that looked old," Daniel said, "which means this wasn't the first time. I'd like to come in tomorrow morning and talk about what's been happening." Another pause. The quality of this one was different. "Of course," Harlow said. "We can certainly set up a time. I'd want to make sure we approach this thoughtfully and make sure we have all the relevant context before 8 o'clock, Daniel said. "I'll be there." He hung up. He sat for a moment with his hand on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the school building, the brick facade, the cheerful painted letters above the main entrance, Emerson Elementary, where every child matters. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he drove home. Olivia fell asleep in the truck before they hit the main road, the way she sometimes did after school, sudden and complete. Like a switch thrown, her head tipped against the window and one hand still loosely around the uneaten half of her sandwich. Daniel drove with his left hand on the wheel and his right hand resting near her knee. Not touching, just near, the way he'd driven when she was a baby in the car seat, and he'd reach back with one hand at red lights, just to feel that she was still there. He thought about Emily. He thought about the last conversation they'd had in the hospital 5 years ago, 3 days before the end. Emily had been conscious but exhausted, the kind of exhausted that goes beyond the body, and she'd held his hand with both of hers and looked at him with eyes that were already doing some kind of letting go. "She's going to need you," Emily had said, not as a warning, as a fact stated simply. "She's soft-hearted, Daniel. Like me, she'll try to protect you from things instead of telling you. Watch for that." He had nodded. He had squeezed her hands. He had not, he thought now, with a particular brand of self-recrimination, watched carefully enough, because Olivia had been protecting him. For months, he didn't know how many yet. But the stain on that sweater had looked old, And old stains meant repeated incidents. And repeated incidents meant a pattern. And a pattern meant time. His 7-year-old daughter had been absorbing something in silence because she was afraid that telling him would hurt him. Emily had told him to watch for it. He had not watched carefully enough. He pulled into the driveway of their house, small, single story, the workshop attached at the back, where he'd rebuilt 3 bikes in the past year, and he sat in the truck for a moment after he cut the engine, just listening to Olivia breathe. 7 years old, she had been carrying something heavy enough to make her shoulders curve inward, and she had done it quietly, and she had looked at him with fear in her eyes when he showed up, not because she was afraid of him, but because she was afraid of what the truth might cost him. 7 years old. He got out of the truck, went around to her side, opened the door carefully, and lifted her out without waking her. She stirred, murmured something, tucked her face against his neck with the trusting animal instinct of a sleeping child. He carried her inside, laid her on her bed, pulled the blanket over her, and stood there for a long time in the doorway, watching her sleep. Then he picked up his phone and called Ricky Santos. Ricky answered on the first ring. He always answered on the first ring. It was a quality Daniel had relied on more times than he could count. "What's wrong?" No preamble. "Just that. I need to talk," Daniel said. "Give me 20 minutes. He was there in 15. Ricky Santos was 51 years old, 6'1", built like a man who'd done physical labor his whole life and intended to keep doing it, with a beard that had gone mostly silver and eyes that were quiet and quick in a way that people sometimes underestimated. He was the road captain of the Bakersfield chapter, had been for 9 years, and he was the person Daniel had called when Emily died, when the shop's water heater exploded and flooded the floor, when the landlord of the building tried to raise the rent by 40% and threatened to involve people who made threats for money. Ricky had a gift for sitting still while you talked. He sat still now at Daniel's kitchen table, while Daniel stood at the counter and laid out everything in sequence: the cafeteria, the floor, the boys, the lunch monitor, Olivia's face, what she'd said in the parking lot, what the principal had said on the phone. When Daniel finished, Ricky was quiet for a moment. "How long?" he said. "I don't know yet." The stain looked old. "A few weeks, maybe more. She didn't tell you. She didn't want to make things worse for me." Daniel set his coffee cup down on the counter. "She's 7 years old, Rick. She was managing my feelings." Ricky exhaled slowly through his nose. "What do you need?" "Tomorrow morning I'm going in to talk to the principal. I need to know what I'm walking into. Who runs that school board? Who's connected to who?" Ricky nodded. "I know a couple of people. Give me tonight. I'm not walking in there blind." "You won't." Daniel looked at him. "And I need you to know that whatever I find out, I'm going to handle this the right way. Not my first instinct, the right way." Ricky met his eyes. "I know that. I just need to say it out loud." "Say it however many times you need to." Daniel turned back to the counter. His hands were flat on the surface, and he was aware of the effort it took to keep them there. She said, "I didn't want to make things worse for you." That's what she said. "My daughter, 7 years old. I heard you. She's been protecting me, I know. Emily asked me to watch for it, Danny." Ricky's voice was quiet but firm. "You're watching for it now. That's what matters." Daniel was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the desert dark had settled fully, the particular dense dark of Bakersfield in October, when the heat finally releases its grip on the day and the night comes in cold and clear and absolute. "Go in tomorrow," Ricky said. "See what they say. Come back and tell me. We'll figure out the rest." The meeting with Principal Harlow the next morning lasted 47 minutes. Daniel knew it was 47 minutes because he looked at his phone when he sat down and again when he stood up. And the discipline of tracking time was a thing he'd learned years ago in situations where time mattered. Harlow was a woman in her late 40s, neatly put together, with the practiced composure of someone who managed people's emotions for a living. She had a vice principal named Garrett sitting, slightly behind, and to her left, not quite participating, not quite observing, occupying the particular ambiguous space of someone who was there to witness without necessarily being accountable. She began by thanking Daniel for coming in. She explained that the school had policies and procedures around these kinds of situations. She used the phrase social dynamics among students twice. She used the phrase age-appropriate conflict resolution once. She mentioned, in a measured and careful way that was clearly not accidental, that the Whitfield family, she didn't volunteer the name. Daniel drew it out with a direct question, had been strong supporters of the school's enrichment programs and that their son Preston was a high-energy child who sometimes struggled with boundaries, but who the school was actively working with. Daniel listened to all of it. He let her finish. Then he said, Mrs. Harlow, how many complaints have been filed about Preston Whitfield? Harlow's composure shifted almost imperceptibly. A slight stillness. I'm not at liberty to share information about other students. I'm not asking about other students. I'm asking about the number of complaints, which is an administrative record. Mr. Carter, I understand your frustration. I'm not frustrated, Daniel said. I'm asking a question. How many complaints about this child have been filed, and what happened to them? Garrett made a small movement behind Harlow. She did not look at him. These things take time, she said carefully. We work with families. We implement strategies. My daughter, Daniel said, has been coming home to me every day for however long this has been happening and not saying a word, because she was worried about upsetting me. He let that sit. She's 7. She's been managing this alone. I need to understand what this school's role in that has been. A long pause. I think, Harlow said, and her voice had shifted into something more guarded, that this might be a conversation that benefits from having the district's family liaison involved. I can arrange. I'll be back Thursday, Daniel said. I'd like a complete record of any complaints or incidents involving my daughter since the start of the school year. That's a reasonable request. He stood up, Mr. Carter. Her voice had an edge now, careful but present. I want to encourage a collaborative approach here. Our goal is always the well-being of all our students, and sometimes that requires Thursday, Daniel said. He looked at her directly, not threatening, just clear. I'll see you Thursday. He walked out. In the parking lot, he called Ricky. Tell me what you found. What Ricky had found, assembled overnight through the particular network of Bakersfield, people who talked to Ricky Santos, because Ricky Santos was trustworthy and discreet and had never once repeated something told to him in confidence, was this. The Whitfield family had lived in Bakersfield for 3 generations. Gerald Whitfield Sr. had built a real estate development company that now managed a significant portion of the commercial property in the town. Gerald Whitfield Jr., Preston's father, had continued and expanded that business. He sat on the school board. He sat on 2 additional community boards. He had been a major donor to Harlow's predecessor and had been publicly supportive of Harlow's appointment. There had been 4 prior complaints about Preston Whitfield filed with the school since the previous school year. 3 involved incidents of physical aggression or property destruction targeting other students. 1 involved a formal written complaint from a parent, the mother of a girl named Cora Mendez, who alleged deliberate targeting and harassment over a period of 6 weeks. None of the complaints had resulted in formal disciplinary action of record. The Mendez complaint had been responded to with a letter assuring the family that the matter was being handled and recommending additional coping strategy resources for the affected student. Daniel sat in the parking lot of his shop and listened to all of this. When Ricky finished, Daniel was quiet for a long moment. There are other families, he finally said. At least one we know about. Probably more. This has been going on since before Olivia started. Looks that way, and Harlow knows. Daniel. Ricky's voice was careful but direct. Harlow knows. Garrett knows. Somebody on that board knows. And the Whitfield money makes knowing inconvenient. Daniel looked out at the shop bay where Tommy Reyes, 26 years old, full of opinions about carburetor rebuild technique. One of the best natural mechanics Daniel had ever seen was working the front desk and pretending not to be watching his boss through the window. I need to talk to the Mendez family, Daniel said. I have a number, and I need to understand what kind of records exist and who can access them. I know a guy, Ricky said. Former school board administrative staffer. Left 3 years ago. Let's just say he left with feelings about the way certain things were handled. Daniel took a slow breath. And Rick, he said, I need to do this right, complete right, documented and above board, and in a way that they can't undo. I know, because if I do this wrong, they win and Olivia loses. And if I do this wrong for the wrong reasons, he stopped. For what reasons? Ricky said. If I do this for my anger instead of for my daughter, I'm not doing it right. A pause on Ricky's end, long enough to be intentional. I've known you for 17 years, Ricky said. You know why I called you the first time and asked you to prospect? You want to know what I told the guys when I brought you in? What? I said. This is a man who's going to be angrier than most and do less with it than anyone. A beat. That's not an insult, Danny. That's the hardest thing there is to be. Daniel didn't say anything. Talk to the Mendez family, Ricky said. Come to church on Sunday. Let me make a call or two. Okay. And Danny, yeah, go home tonight and sit with your daughter. That's the first thing. He sat with Olivia that night. After dinner, scrambled eggs, because it was her favorite, and because some nights he feeds his daughter scrambled eggs at 6 p.m. and doesn't apologize for it. They sat on the floor of the living room the way they sometimes did, backs against the couch, Olivia with a drawing pad in her lap, and Daniel beside her with his coffee. She was drawing something. He waited. She drew for a long time. A house, a truck, a figure with dark hair himself. He recognized the jacket and a smaller figure beside it. Yellow sweater. Livy, he said. She kept drawing. Yeah? I need you to tell me something. And I need you to know that whatever you tell me, it's okay. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't hurt me. It doesn't make things worse. You understand? She looked up from her drawing. Her eyes were very serious. She was Emily's eyes. This child, the same particular shade of brown, the same quality of attention. Okay, she said. How long has Preston been doing things to you? She looked back down at her drawing. Her pencil stilled. Since September, she said quietly. September. It was now mid-October, 6-7 weeks. What kinds of things? She told him. It took a long time. She spoke in the careful, measured way of a child who has been constructing an internal narrative out of something painful and has gotten used to holding it internally, choosing words, ordering events, leaving out the parts she thought might upset him most. He recognized the editing because he knew his daughter and he let her do it because the editing itself was information. She told him about the lunch tray multiple times, not just yesterday, about comments about his motorcycle, about comments about her mother that she didn't repeat verbatim, and he did not push her to, about telling her homeroom teacher, Miss Pellegrino, after the third incident, and Miss Pellegrino saying she would look into it, and then for 3 days, being visibly uncomfortable whenever Olivia was near her, about telling a lunch aide, whose name she didn't know, who had said boys are just like that sometimes, about deciding, after that there was no point in telling. I figured, Olivia said, very precisely, her pencil moving again, that if telling didn't help, then the only thing telling would do was make you upset. And I didn't want you to be upset. Daniel looked at the side of his daughter's face, at the careful way she was shading the little figure in the yellow sweater, at the way her hand moved, deliberate and gentle, the same way Emily's hand had moved when she sketched things out on paper. His voice was very quiet. Making me upset is okay. Making me upset is what I'm here for. You understand? She glanced at him sideways. You have enough to worry about. I worry about you. That's my job. That's what I signed up for when you were born. You're not protecting me from my job. She was quiet for a moment. Mom used to say that, she said. His throat tightened. I know, he said. She said you carried things quietly. Olivia looked at him fully now, with a directness that was startling in a 7-year-old and completely characteristic of this specific one. She said that was good, but it was also lonely. And she said, I should never let you be lonelier than you had to be. He looked at his daughter. She said that? She told me a lot of things, Olivia said simply. Like this was obvious. She knew she wasn't going to be there. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, easily, without the cautious quality she'd had at the cafeteria. Just his daughter leaning against his side the way she had since before she could walk. We're going to fix this, he said. Not just for you. For all the other kids that this has been happening to. Okay. She was quiet for a moment. Are you going to get in trouble? No, because I'm going to do it right. How do you know the right way? He thought about that. Because I've spent a lot of years learning what the wrong way looks like, he said. So I know where not to step. She considered this with the philosophical solemnity of a child who takes answers seriously. Okay, she said. She went back to her drawing. He sat beside her and drank his coffee. And outside the desert, dark moved in close and cold around the house. And inside the lamp was on. And the drawing pad rustled. And somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle turned onto their street and moved past. The engine sounded familiar and low, like a pulse. Rosa Mendez agreed to meet him at the diner on Oleander Avenue on Friday afternoon. She came in with her daughter Cora, who was 8, a year older than Olivia. With a watchful quality that Daniel recognized immediately and hated recognizing, with the particular energy of a woman who had tried the official channels and come back empty and was not sure whether this conversation was going to be any different. He understood that energy. He respected it. He did not begin by asking her to trust him. He began by telling her what had happened to Olivia. All of it in plain language. He told her about the cafeteria floor and the whispered, "Please don't get mad," and the 6 weeks of silence and the 2 adults who'd been in the room and done nothing. Rosa Mendez listened with her hands flat on the table and her jaw set. When he finished, she said, "They told me Cora needed to work on her conflict resolution skills." "I know," Daniel said. "I've seen the letter." She looked at him. "How did you see the letter?" "Because I know people who know how things work in this town. And because I'm not going to walk into this blind and get managed, and walk back out again with nothing." She studied him for a long moment. Cora was quietly drawing something on a napkin with a pen she'd produced from somewhere. "What do you want?" Rosa said. "I want to know what happened to your daughter, in detail. And I want to know if you'd be willing to be part of something bigger than just our 2 kids. What's bigger? Making sure this is documented, public, and impossible to bury." He looked at her steadily. "The Whitfield family has money and connections. The only thing bigger than money and connections is people who refuse to be quiet at the same time." Rosa Mendez looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at her daughter, who was still drawing on the napkin, the small, careful, deliberate movements of a child making something in a public place, because creating was a way of being somewhere safe. "The aide who told me Cora was being overdramatic," Rosa said quietly, "also told me that Preston's family had donated the new gymnasium equipment." She paused. "She didn't mean to tell me that. But she did." "I know," Daniel said. "There are other families." Her voice was different now, quieter but somehow denser, more weighted. "I've talked to 2 others who pulled their kids. One who's kept her daughter home twice this month to avoid it. She's afraid to file because her husband works for a company that leases property from the Whitfields." Daniel was very still. "How many?" he said. "More than 2. Maybe more than 5. She looked back at him. "How serious are you?" "Completely. Because these families need to know it's going to mean something. They can't put their necks out and then have it disappear. They've already tried once. They need to know it's going to matter." "It's going to matter," Daniel said. "How do you know?" And Daniel Carter, who had learned a long time ago that some answers have to be earned through action rather than words, said the only true thing he had, "Because I'm not going to stop until it does." Rosa Mendez sat with that. Then she nodded. One time, slow and deliberate and final. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you need." He got home late. Olivia was already asleep. He stood in her doorway the same way he'd stood the night before, watching her breathe in the lamp glow from the hall. And he thought about all the children in this town who had been given the same message in 100 different ways, that their pain was inconvenient, that the adults around them had other priorities, that the proper response to being hurt was to be smaller and quieter and less trouble. He thought about what Emily had said. "She's soft-hearted, like me. Watch for that." He thought about the stain on the yellow sweater that had looked old. He had not watched carefully enough. That was true, and he would carry it. But carrying it was not the same as being defeated by it. The guilt was information. The guilt said, pay attention now, differently, with more intention. He went to the kitchen and called Ricky. Rosa Mendez is in, he said. She knows at least 5 other families. Maybe more. A silence on Ricky's end, not surprise. Something more like recognition. Okay, Ricky said. Sunday, you said church. Sunday, Ricky confirmed. Bring everything you have so far. All of it. I'll be there. He hung up. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, in the quiet of the house. His daughter asleep down the hall, the desert night flat, and still outside the windows. Somewhere, a child he'd never met had gone home that day and said nothing about the thing that had happened at school, because she had already learned that saying something didn't help. Somewhere, a mother had opened a letter and read the words conflict resolution, skills, and felt something in her fold inward. Somewhere, a man in a very good jacket sat in a very nice house and gave not one single thought to the cascade of small damages that had gone out from his son and landed on children who had done nothing to deserve them. Daniel Carter stood in his kitchen and thought about all of this. And then he went to bed, because Sunday was coming and he was going to be ready for it. Sunday morning arrived the way Bakersfield Octobers always did, cold before the sun cleared the ridge. Then suddenly not cold at all, the temperature shifting fast enough that you could feel the day making up its mind. Daniel was up before 6. He made coffee, stood at the kitchen window with his mug, and listened to the house breathe around him. Olivia was still asleep. He checked on her at 5:30 out of habit, old habit, the kind you develop when you spend years being the only adult in a house with a small child, and she'd been curled on her side, with both hands tucked under her chin, the way she'd slept since she was an infant. He looked at the yellow sweater on the chair by her door. He'd washed it yesterday. The stain was mostly gone. He drank his coffee and thought about what he was carrying into church that morning and what he intended to walk out with. The Bakersfield chapter held their Sunday meetings in the back room of Carver's, a bar and grill on the south side of town that had been serving as an unofficial clubhouse for 15 years. The arrangement worked because the owner, Pete Carver, was a former member who'd stepped back from active riding after a knee surgery, but had never stepped back from anything that mattered to the people he'd ridden with. He kept the back room available on Sundays, kept the coffee hot, and had a talent for being somewhere else in the building when conversations needed to happen without witnesses. Daniel arrived at 7:50. There were already 9 bikes in the lot. Inside, the back room smelled like coffee and leather, and the particular sawdust and grease scent that follows men who work with their hands everywhere they go. Ricky was at the head of the table. Big Joe Caruso was beside him, 58 years old, hands like construction equipment, a man who had the quality of seeming completely relaxed while being intensely alert, which Daniel had always found reassuring. Tommy Reyes had come in early despite it being his day off, sitting at the far end of the table with a legal pad and a pen that he kept clicking in a rhythm until Big Joe looked at him and he stopped. There were 7 others. Some Daniel had known for years. Some were newer, brought in over the past few seasons, but all of them had been through enough together that the room had the quality of people who had learned to trust each other, not from theory, but from evidence. Daniel sat down, put his folder on the table, looked at Ricky. Tell them, Ricky said. He told them. He told it the same way he'd told Rosa Mendez, plain, sequenced, without editorializing, because the facts were already heavy enough, without decoration. The cafeteria, the floor. Olivia's whispered request that he not get mad. The principal meeting and what Harlow had said versus what she'd carefully not said. Ricky's overnight research. The Whitfield family's position in the town. The 4 buried complaints. The Mendez family. The other parents Rosa had named, living quietly under the weight of something they'd been told they couldn't fix. Nobody interrupted. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Big Joe was the first to speak. How old is the kid? The Whitfield boy? 9. 9 years old and 4 complaints buried. Joe's voice was flat, not rhetorical. What does that tell you about the father? It tells me the father made a calculation, Daniel said, that his position in this town was worth more than accountability for his son, and the school backed that calculation. At every step, with every family. Tommy Reyes had started writing on his legal pad without deciding to. The former staffer Ricky mentioned. The one who left 3 years ago. His name is Marcus Webb, Ricky said. He worked in the district administrative office for 11 years. He processed complaints, filed records, worked directly under the superintendent's office. And he left with feelings. He left, Ricky said carefully, with documentation. The room shifted, not loudly. Just a change in the air pressure, the kind that happens when a conversation moves from grievance to possibility. What kind of documentation? Big Joe said. I haven't talked to him yet, Ricky said. I have his number. I wanted to know if this was something we were doing before I made that call. He looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the room. I want to be clear about what I'm asking, Daniel said. I'm not asking anyone to go start trouble. I'm not asking anyone to put their name on something they're not comfortable with. What I'm asking is whether we, as a group, are willing to help make sure that what happened to my daughter, and what happened to Cora Mendez and the other kids we don't know yet doesn't get buried again. Legally, carefully, and publicly enough that they can't make it disappear. Silence. Big Joe looked at the ceiling briefly, which was something he did when he was thinking, not when he was uncertain. I've got a daughter, he said. She's grown now, 26, lives in Sacramento, works for a hospital. He paused. When she was in 5th grade, there was a situation with a teacher, said something to her in front of the class, humiliated her. We went to the school. We were told he was a good teacher having a hard year. Another pause. We moved her to another school. She was fine eventually, but she remembers it. She mentioned it to me 2 years ago at Christmas, like it was still current. 15 years later, nobody spoke. You don't forget, Joe said. That's the thing. Kids don't forget. They build around it, most of them, but they don't forget. He looked at Daniel. I'm in. Around the table, in the manner of men who don't make declarations lightly, there were nods, some verbal, some not. Tommy stopped clicking his pen. All right, Ricky said. I'll call Marcus Webb today. Marcus Webb agreed to meet on Monday evening. He lived in a house on the east side of town that had the particular quality of a place where someone had stopped caring about appearances without becoming slovenly. The lawn was cut, but not edged. The porch light worked, but the bulb was the wrong color for the fixture. A man managing the basics, and not much beyond that. He was 53, thin in a way that suggested he'd been thinner recently, and was slowly filling back out, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful diction of someone who chose every word as a matter of principle. He opened the door before Daniel and Ricky reached the porch step. He had been watching for them. You're Carter, he said to Daniel. Not a question. Yes. And Santos, you run the chapter. Road Captain, Ricky said pleasantly, which was technically accurate and also slightly misleading about how much authority it represented, in the way that Ricky was sometimes deliberately imprecise about things. Webb looked at them both for a moment with the alert, assessing quality of a man who had spent 11 years in an administrative office and had learned to read situations from thin evidence. Come in, he said. His kitchen table was covered in folders. Daniel registered this before he sat down. The folders, the arrangement of them, the deliberate placement of a cup of coffee and 2 additional mugs, the single legal pad with handwritten notes at the top. Marcus Webb had been expecting to use this material. He had been waiting for someone to ask. How long? Daniel said, before anything else. Webb looked at him. How long what? How long have you been sitting on this? A pause. Webb wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. 3 years since I left. The material goes back further. 7-8 years of documented complaints, filed dispositions, administrative decisions. He set the cup down. When I left, I took copies of everything I was legally permitted to take, which, in an administrative capacity with the access level I had, was more than most people would expect. And you didn't do anything with it, Ricky said. Not an accusation. An observation with a question inside it. I tried, Webb said. Once, 2 years ago, I approached a reporter at the Californian. She was interested. She started making calls. He was quiet for a moment. She got a call from her editor. The story didn't run. The editor got a call, Daniel said. I can't prove that, Webb said carefully, but the timing was specific. And the reporter, who I still have contact with, was not happy about it. She moved to a station in Sacramento 8 months later. Daniel thought about what Rosa Mendez had said. They can't put their necks out and then have it disappear. They need to know it's going to matter. There's a specific family involved, Daniel said. Whitfield. Webb's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A slight settling, like a man recognizing the shape of the conversation he'd known was coming. Gerald Whitfield Jr. has sat on the school board for 6 years, Webb said. Before that, his father was involved in the district's capital improvement planning. The family has donated to 3 consecutive superintendent campaigns and the current superintendent's professional development fund. And the complaints about Preston Whitfield, 4 filed during my tenure, 2 before I left, all responded to with administrative correspondence citing privacy protections and ongoing intervention plans. He paused. None resulted in formal disciplinary record that would follow the student, which means, Daniel said, that if Preston Whitfield moves to a new school or the family moves to a new district, there's no record. Correct. Which means this can happen again. Has happened again, Webb said quietly. He wasn't enrolled at Emerson last year. He was at Crestview. I don't have records from Crestview different district, different files, but I have correspondence from 2 families at Crestview that came to our office after they moved their children to our district. They mentioned reasons. They didn't file formal complaints there, but the patterns they described. He stopped. Were consistent, Ricky said. Yes. The kitchen was very quiet. Daniel looked at the folders on the table. What's in those? 11 years of administrative records, complaint logs, filed dispositions and their dates, internal communications about specific cases, including several where the suggested response was drafted in the superintendent's office and sent down to principal level. He met Daniel's eyes. There are emails, Mr. Carter, from the principal level, from the district level, discussing specific families and their likelihood to escalate or not. Identifying families they assessed as having less capacity to create sustained pressure. Daniel felt something cold move through him. They profiled the families, not formally, but effectively, yes. They identified who they could ignore. They identified, Webb said precisely, who they could respond to with a letter and who would come back with a lawyer. The room was very quiet. My daughter, Daniel said, was in the second category. Almost certainly. Single-parent household, no listed professional affiliation. Father affiliated with. Webb stopped himself. With a motorcycle club, Daniel finished. Say it. Yes, Daniel sat with that for a moment. The cold thing moved through him, again, and he let it move through. Because the anger was useful information, and the cold version of it was more useful than the hot version. What do you need from us? Ricky said. A journalist who can't be pressured through a local editor, Webb said immediately. It was clearly a prepared answer. Someone with institutional backing outside this market, and a group of families willing to go on record together because a single family can be managed, and 2 families can be managed, but a coordinated group of families with documentation and a media partner that has legal resources behind it is a different thing entirely. We have families, Daniel said. How many? 5 confirmed. Probably more. Webb absorbed this. The set of his shoulders changed almost imperceptibly, some long-held tension releasing a fraction. I have a contact, he said slowly, at a television station in Los Angeles. I've never used it. I've held it because I was waiting to have enough. I didn't have enough alone. He looked at Daniel. With 5 families and this documentation, we might have enough. Make the call, Daniel said. If I make this call, it becomes real, Webb said. And when it becomes real, the Whitfield family will know it's coming before it airs. They have people. They will apply pressure. They will try to identify who spoke, and there will be consequences attempted against those people. I know, Daniel said. You need to be prepared for that. I know, Daniel said again. Mr. Carter Webb looked at him, directly with the focused, careful gaze of a man who wanted to be clearly understood. I want to do this. I have wanted to do this for 3 years. But I've also watched what happened to the journalist who tried. And I have to know that the people involved understand the cost. The cost, Daniel said, of not doing it is a 7-year-old girl on a cafeteria floor deciding that her pain is something she has to carry alone. He held Webb's gaze. And another one. And another one after that. Because the calculation keeps working as long as nobody makes it stop working. Webb was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and put his hand flat on the top folder. All right, he said. I'll make the call. The journalist's name was Andrea Voss. She was 39, based out of a Los Angeles investigative news desk with national network affiliation. And she had a reputation. Ricky verified this through 3 separate people before Daniel agreed to the meeting for taking cases that involved institutional power and systemic failure rather than individual incident stories. She had covered a district attorney's office in the Central Valley 2 years prior that had resulted in 3 criminal referrals. She had covered a water authority scandal that was still in litigation. She drove up from LA on a Wednesday morning and met Daniel, Ricky, and Marcus Webb at Webb's kitchen table. She was compact, dark-haired, with the particular quality of someone who listened with their whole body, leaning slightly forward, eyes moving, hands still, giving the impression that she was recording everything on multiple channels simultaneously. She brought a small recorder, set it on the table, and asked permission before she turned it on. She brought a legal pad. She brought a laptop. She asked Daniel to start from the beginning. He started with the cafeteria. He ended with the 5 families. She didn't interrupt once. She didn't make notes while he talked. Afterward, she sat back and was quiet for a moment. The way people who think rigorously are sometimes quiet before they speak. The documentation Webb has, she said. The internal communications you mentioned. The emails discussing family profiles. Yes, Webb said. I'll need to verify provenance. Chain of custody on how you acquired them. I can provide that. And the families. I'll need to speak to them directly. On the record, at least 2. Off the record corroboration from the others, if that's what they're comfortable with. Rosa Mendez has already said on the record, Daniel said. Good. Voss looked at him. I want to be clear about something. This is a real story. If the documentation is what Webb says it is, and if we have families willing to speak, this is a story that has legs beyond Bakersfield. The pattern Webb's describing, how complaints are identified and managed based on family profile, that's not unique to this district. I've seen it in 4 other counties. She paused, which means when it airs, it won't just be local. And that changes the pressure dynamic considerably. In what direction? Ricky said. Both directions. More institutional protection for the story, because it becomes a larger narrative with national significance. But also more scrutiny on the families involved, more pressure on them. The Whitfield family will have more tools to push back if the story goes national, because they'll have more to lose. Let them use their tools, Daniel said. Voss looked at him with a directness that wasn't aggressive but was absolutely focused. You understand what that might look like? Legally, professionally, socially. I run a motorcycle repair shop, Daniel said. I'm not easy to threaten professionally, and I've been socially complicated my whole life. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Voss's face. What about the other families? I'll talk to them, Daniel said. Every one of them. In person. And I'll tell them exactly what you just told me. And if some of them decide the risk is too high, then that's their call to make. And I respect it. But I'll make sure they're deciding with full information, not deciding out of fear of something that might not come. Voss nodded slowly. Give me a week to review Webb's documentation. I'll come back with a producer, and we'll talk about timeline and process. She turned off the recorder. She closed her laptop. One more thing, she said. She was looking at Daniel now with a different quality of attention, not the investigative focus of the past hour, but something more direct and personal. What you're doing. Going to the school board. Organizing families. Coming to me. She paused. Most people in your position don't do this. They get angry. They make some calls. It goes nowhere. and they move their kid to another school and try to forget about it. I know, Daniel said. Why are you different? He thought about Emily, about the hospital room, and the things she'd said about carrying things quietly, about standing in a cafeteria doorway with a paper bag and seeing his daughter on the floor. Because she said, "Please don't get mad," he said. She was more worried about me than about herself. And that's my failure before it's anyone else's failure. So the fixing is mine to do. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. I'll be in touch. He drove home thinking about the other families. There were 5. Rosa had given him names, neighborhoods, general outlines of situations. He had made preliminary contact with 2 of them by phone careful calls, identifying himself simply as a parent with a child at Emerson who was trying to understand the full scope of what was happening. Both calls had been received with the particular quality of people who wanted to talk but were not yet sure if they could trust the person asking. He understood. Trust was not given because someone seemed sincere. Trust was earned through consistency and through demonstrating that you had something at stake too. He was not asking these families to take risks he wasn't taking himself. He parked in front of his shop instead of going straight home. Tommy's truck was there. The kid had been putting in extra hours lately without being asked, which Daniel noticed and intended to address properly when the time was right. He went in through the side door. Tommy looked up from the bike he was working on, a '78 Sportster. Owner restoration project, sentimental value, outstripping, mechanical condition, and registered quick perceptiveness of someone who'd spent enough time around him to read his baseline. How'd it go? Good, I think. Daniel pulled up a stool. You know the Delgado family? Over on Sutter? Tommy thought. Eddie Delgado, he comes in sometimes. Older gentleman, retired, usually brings his wife's car in for the oil changes. He paused. Yeah, I know him. His granddaughter is at Emerson. Tommy set down his wrench carefully. Same situation? Rosa says yes. Tommy looked at the Sportster for a moment, not really seeing it. He was 26 and had grown up in Bakersfield and had the institutional memory of someone who'd come up through the town's school system himself. The Delgados aren't going to talk to a journalist, he said. Eddie's been here his whole life. He's not going to want to be on television. I know, Daniel said. I'm not asking him to be on television. I'm asking him to be present. There's a difference. What kind of present? Daniel looked at him. You know what kind. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his wrench again, turned back to the Sportster, and said, You want me to talk to him first? Before you go over there? He knows me, it might go easier. Yeah, Daniel said. That would help. Okay. Tommy adjusted something on the engine. I'll go over there Thursday after close. Daniel stood up. He put a hand on Tommy's shoulder briefly as I passed. The kind of contact that doesn't require a word and doesn't get one. He drove home. Olivia was at the kitchen table doing homework math worksheets, her pencil moving in the quick, decisive way she had when she was confident about the answers and bored with the process of writing them down. She looked up when he came in. How was your day? She asked. Long, he said. Good, I think. You think? Sometimes you don't know if something was good until later. He opened the fridge, looked into it with the thoughtful vacancy of someone not really seeing what was there. How was school? A pause. Small and telling. Fine, she said. He turned. She was looking back at her worksheet. Her pencil had stopped. Livy, he didn't do anything today, she said quietly. He just looked at me in the hall. That's all. What kind of looking? She shrugged. One shoulder. The careful, small gesture of a child minimizing something. Like he knew something I didn't. Daniel came and sat down across from her at the table. He waited until she looked up. Does he do that often? The looking? Sometimes. She looked back at her paper. It's worse than when he says stuff, because when he says stuff, there's something to tell. When he just looks, there's nothing to say, and you still feel it. He thought about a 9-year-old boy who had learned that the most effective intimidation left no evidence, who had learned that at 9, where he'd learned it wasn't hard to guess. Tell me anyway, Daniel said. Even when there's nothing specific, just tell me. She looked at him. Why? What can you do about a look? Nothing today, he said honestly. But it's still information, and information matters. She seemed to think about this with the particular seriousness she brought to things she was genuinely puzzling through. Okay, she said. She went back to her worksheet. He sat with her while she finished it, and they ate dinner together. And he helped her practice the spelling words. She had a test on Friday, and after she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his phone and Webb's notes and the list of 5 family names and thought carefully about the sequence of the next several days. The complaint meeting with Harlow was Thursday. He hadn't canceled it. He intended to keep it, not because he expected anything useful from Harlow anymore, but because keeping the official channel open and documented was part of doing this right. Every meeting on record, every request in writing, every non-response and deflection creating its own paper trail. He sent Rosa Mendez a text, meeting Thursday with Harlow, bringing written request for incident records. Should be documented for Voss. Rosa responded in 3 minutes. I'll send you the letter I wrote them last year. Attach it to your request. He sat with his phone for a moment. Then he wrote back, thank you. She wrote, don't thank me. Just don't stop. He set the phone down. Outside, the night had come in full and cold, and the desert was doing its particular thing of being enormous and indifferent, and somehow, because of that, clarifying. He had grown up in small towns and spent time in cities and come back to small towns. And the thing about small towns was that you felt both the weight of other people's decisions and the weight of your own in a way that cities let you dilute. In a small town, what you did and didn't do had a shape you couldn't avoid seeing. He had not watched carefully enough. He was watching now. He pulled the list of family names toward him, picked up a pen, and began organizing what he knew and what he still needed to find out. Carmen Ibanez, whose daughter had been told by a teacher that she was too sensitive. The Kowalski family, whose son had stopped eating lunch at school to avoid encounters in the cafeteria. The Delgado granddaughter, who Tommy would approach Thursday. All of these children, all of these families, all of this quiet, distributed pain that had been identified and managed and carefully never allowed to coalesce into something that required a response. He worked until midnight. Then he went to bed. He was up at 5:30 and checked on Olivia curled on her side, both hands under her chin, breathing steady, and stood in her doorway for a moment in the dark. She looked small. She was small. 7 years old and already fluent in the grammar of making yourself invisible to protect someone else's feelings. He had not watched carefully enough, and he would not make peace with that, and the not making peace with it was the engine. He went and started the coffee. The Thursday meeting with Harlow lasted 22 minutes. Daniel arrived with a written request, 2 pages, specific, citing the relevant California Education Code sections that governed parental access to records, drafted with the help of a paralegal in Fresno that Ricky had located through the chapter's network, and placed it on Harlow's desk at the beginning of the meeting. Harlow looked at it, looked at him. I'll need to have this reviewed by the district office, she said. The statute gives the district 15 business days to respond, Daniel said. The clock starts today. I'd appreciate a written acknowledgement of receipt before I leave. Garrett, the vice principal, was in the room again. He was less comfortable this time. His hands were on the table in front of him in a way that looked deliberately calibrated to appear relaxed. Mr. Carter, Harlow said, I want to revisit my suggestion from Tuesday about involving the family liaison. I'd like to focus on the records request, Daniel said pleasantly. And I have a second written request here as well. He placed a second document on the desk. This is a formal request for the complete record of incidents and filed complaints involving the student Preston Whitfield during his enrollment at Emerson Elementary. I understand there may be privacy limitations on student records, but the California Education Code provides specific allowances when a requesting party can demonstrate direct involvement in related incidents. I've cited those allowances on page 2. The silence in the room had a different texture than the previous meeting's silence. Harlow looked at the documents. She was very controlled, but something in the set of her jaw was working harder than it had been 2 days ago. These will need to go to the district office, she said again. I understand. I'd still like the written acknowledgement. A pause that lasted slightly too long. Charlene Harlow said to someone beyond the partially open office door, "Can you come in here for a moment?" The administrative assistant came in. Harlow asked for the documents to be logged and a receipt to be prepared. The assistant, a woman in her 40s, who did not look at either Harlow or Daniel with any particular expression, took the papers and left. While they waited, the room held a particular kind of quiet that was not comfortable for everyone present equally. "Mr. Carter," Harlow said, in a tone that had shifted again, "I want to be transparent with you about something. Please. The district is aware of your visit Tuesday. There are parties who have expressed concern about the nature of your inquiries." "What parties?" "I'm not in a position to—" "What parties?" Daniel said again, with the same pleasant tone and the same absolute stillness. Harlow's composure held, but it was working. "I've been advised to remind you that Emerson Elementary and the Bakersfield Unified School District have robust legal resources and that any—" "Mrs. Harlow." Daniel looked at her directly, not threatening, not loud, just clear in the way that people who have thought carefully about exactly what they're going to say and exactly why they're going to say it are clear. "I am a parent making a legal records request under California Education Code. I am not doing anything that requires a legal warning. If the district is involving its legal resources in response to a records request from a parent, that's very interesting information." He paused one beat. "I'd put that in writing if I were you. It would be good documentation." Something moved across Garrett's face that he quickly controlled. The administrative assistant returned with a stamped receipt. Daniel took it, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. He stood up. "Thank you for your time," he said. "I'll look forward to hearing from the district office." He walked out. In the parking lot, he sat in his truck for a moment. His hands were entirely steady on the steering wheel. He was aware of the steadiness as a thing he'd worked for the discipline of years of directing his own reactions. He called Ricky. They've already talked to the Whitfields. Ricky was quiet for a brief moment. "How do you know?" "Harlow started to give me a legal warning. At a records request meeting. She'd been briefed. That was fast." "Gerald Whitfield sits on the school board," Daniel said. "There's probably a phone call that happened the same day I walked in Tuesday. Maybe the same afternoon. Which means they know who you are and what you're doing." "Yes." And Daniel looked at the school building through the windshield, "where every child matters, and it means we need to move faster than they expect us to," he said. "Voss needs to know they're already activated. Webb needs to know. And I need to talk to the other families before the Whitfields do." "I'll call Voss," Ricky said. "I'll start with the Ibanez family tonight. Danny." Ricky's voice had a particular quality, not worried, exactly, but attentive in a specific way. "They're going to push back on you personally, not just legally. Personally. You ready for that? What does that look like? Could be anything. Business interference, social pressure, someone showing up at the shop with a conversation you don't want to have. Let them come, have a conversation," Daniel said. "I'm serious." "So am I," he started the truck. "And Rick, when they do push back, whatever form it takes, I need that documented too. Every instance. Because the story isn't just what they did to the kids. It's what they do when someone tries to stop them." A pause. "That's smart," Ricky said. "It's what they taught me," Daniel said. "When the institution protects itself instead of the people it's supposed to serve, the protection itself becomes the evidence." He pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward the south side of town, and the house where Carmen Ibanez lived with her daughter and her mother, and whatever weight she'd been carrying since the letter from the school district told her that her child needed to work on her conflict resolution skills. He had 4 more families to reach before the Whitfields reached them first. He drove. The call came at 11:17 on a Tuesday night, 3 days before the school board meeting. Daniel was still up. He'd stopped pretending to go to bed at a reasonable hour 2 weeks ago, when the weight of what was coming made sleep something that happened in short, practical intervals rather than a thing he looked forward to. He was at the kitchen table, with a mug that had gone cold and a legal pad covered in notes when his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He picked up. "Mr. Carter." The voice was male, measured, the kind of voice that had been professionally managed for a long time. "My name is Richard Cale. I'm an attorney representing the Whitfield family." Daniel set down his pen. "It's almost midnight, Mr. Cale. I apologize for the hour. I was asked to make contact urgently." "All right." Daniel kept his voice completely neutral. "I'm listening. My clients have become aware of your activities over the past several weeks. The records requests, your conversations with other families, your contact with a television journalist." A deliberate pause. "They'd like to resolve this matter quietly and respectfully, without the situation escalating further." "What situation are we talking about?" "The concerns you have about your daughter's experience at Emerson Elementary." "I see." Daniel looked at the legal pad, at the names written there. At Olivia's spelling test from Friday, still on the corner of the table, a red star drawn on it by her teacher, Ms. Pellegrino, who had looked away, who had been uncomfortable, who had chosen silence. He thought about that red star. He thought about the irony of it. What does resolving it quietly look like from your client's perspective? "My clients are prepared to make a significant donation to the school's anti-bullying program. They'd like to arrange a formal conversation between the families involved and the school administration to address concerns directly. And they'd like to discuss the possibility of a mutual agreement going forward that would allow all parties to stop," Daniel said. A pause. "Mr. Carter, I heard what you said. I want to make sure I understand it correctly." He kept his voice even and careful and completely without heat, because the heat was there, but it wasn't useful right now. "Your clients are offering money to the school. A private meeting with no press and no documentation requirements. And a mutual agreement, which I assume means a non-disclosure arrangement of some kind. A beat. These would be the broad strokes, yes. And in exchange, I and the other families would what? Step from the records requests, decline to participate in any media coverage. We're simply hoping to find a path that serves everyone's interests," Kay said smoothly, "including the children involved." "Who, Mr. Cale?" Daniel's voice hadn't changed temperature, but something in it had become very precise. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to relay it to your clients exactly as I say it. Will you do that?" A brief pause. "Of course. My daughter came home from school for 6 weeks without telling me what was happening to her, because she was afraid that knowing would hurt me. She was 7 years old, and she was managing my emotional well-being while a 9-year-old boy destroyed her lunch and mocked her dead mother and was protected by every adult in that building because his family writes checks." He stopped for exactly 1 second. "There is no amount of money that your clients can put in front of me that addresses what that sentence means. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The line was quiet. "There are other families," Daniel continued. "They've been waiting years for someone to make this impossible to ignore. What your clients are asking me to do is take the one thing those families have, the fact that this is finally, for the first time, going to be seen, and trade it for a number. I won't do that." He picked up his pen again. "If your clients want to do something useful, they can start by telling their son the truth about why what he did was wrong. That would be more valuable than any amount of money." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'll relay your response," Cale said finally. The professional smoothness had thinned very slightly at the edges. "Thank you," Daniel said. "Good night." He hung up. He sat for a moment with his hand flat on the phone. Then he picked it up again and called Ricky. "They just tried to buy me out," he said when Ricky answered. "Tonight?" 11:17 p.m. "Attorney named Richard Cale. That name means something." Ricky's voice had shifted into the focused register he used when he was thinking fast. "Cale and Partners in Fresno. They handle the Whitfield family's business litigation and board-level disputes. They sent their main firm, not a local hire, which means Gerald Whitfield is scared. Or calculating," Daniel said. "Scared and calculating aren't the same thing. He might be trying this first because it's cheaper and cleaner, but he's also already preparing for the next move." "What's the next move?" I don't know yet, but it's coming. Daniel looked at the ceiling. I recorded the call, a beat. You recorded it. California is a two-party consent state, Daniel said. But I consented, and I informed him at the start that the call might be recorded for my personal records. I said it quickly, and he moved past it, which is interesting in itself. I have a lawyer in Fresno who can advise on admissibility. When did you get a lawyer in Fresno? About 10 days ago. When I realized this was going to get complicated before it got simple. He paused. I've been doing this right, Rick. Every step. I need you to know that. I know that, Ricky said. I've known that since Sunday at Carver's. Call me if you hear anything tonight. I don't think they're done. Same, he set the phone down. Looked at the legal pad. Picked up the pen. He wrote down the time of the call, the attorney's name, the substance of the offer, and his own response. He wrote it in the same careful, sequential way. He'd been documenting everything because the story of what had happened to these children was important. But the story of how the Whitfield family responded when it was exposed was equally important. And Andrea Voss had told him exactly that 2 weeks ago. The corruption isn't just in what they did, she'd said. It's in what they do when they get caught doing it. He wrote until 1 a.m. Then he went to check on Olivia. She was asleep, both hands under her chin, breathing steady. He stood in her doorway and thought about the school board meeting in 3 days and everything that needed to happen between now and then. Then he went to bed. He was up at 5. He drove to the Ibanez house at 7 in the morning because Carmen had called him at 6:43 and her voice had a quality he recognized, the compressed, controlled quality of someone managing something that had happened very recently. Carmen met him at the door before he knocked. She was 34, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who had built her life through careful decisions and was extremely uncomfortable when someone else's choices put her decisions at risk. She had a daughter named Sophia who was 6 years old and had not eaten the school's hot lunch in 3 weeks because of what happened in the lunch line the week before the fall break. Someone came by last night, Carmen said, before he was fully inside. A man I don't know. He knocked on my door at 9 o'clock. Daniel felt the back of his neck tighten. What did he say? He said he was a neighbor of the Whitfields. Said he was passing along a message from a concerned community member. Her jaw was set. Her arms were crossed. She was angry, but the anger was organized, directed like a tool rather than an explosion. He said that there was going to be significant attention on the families involved in the school board situation, that the press could be his word, indiscriminate, that Sophia's name might come up, that it might affect her going forward. He threatened your daughter, Daniel said flatly. He was very careful not to use that word. Carmen's voice was tight. He said, concerned community member. He said, indiscriminate. He left a business card for a family counseling service, which was so far beyond insulting that I actually laughed. Do you still have the card? She went to the kitchen counter and handed it to him. He looked at it, photographed it with his phone, handed it back. This is what I told you might happen, he said. I know. She looked at him directly. I'm not backing out. I want you to know that. I'm angrier now than I was yesterday. And yesterday I was already angry enough to file 5 separate lawsuits if I had the money. She paused. But I need to know, is this going to work? Not just morally work, actually work. Are these people going to face something real? Yes, Daniel said. Tell me why you believe that. Because Andrea Voss has been building this story for 3 weeks. Because Marcus Webb's documentation goes back 8 years and is legally obtained and has been verified by Voss's network legal team. Because we have 6 families on record, 3 of them willing to appear on camera, and documented evidence of how the school district profiled families by their capacity to push back. He looked at her steadily. And because a man called me at 11:17 last night offering money to make this go away. That call is recorded. And it's now part of the story. Carmen Ibanez looked at him for a long moment. They tried to buy you, yes, and you said no. Yeah, she uncrossed her arms, breathed out slowly. Okay, she said. What do I need to do between now and Thursday? Nothing different, he said. Show up Thursday, bring Sophia's records. Stand in that room and let them see that you're not afraid. He paused. Are you afraid? Completely, she said, without hesitation. But I'm doing it anyway. That's the only kind of courage that counts, he said. She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to her face, but it got close. He left and drove directly to the Kowalski house, then to Rosa Mendez, then to the Delgados, where Eddie Delgado answered the door in a bathrobe and was already angry because his wife had received a phone call the previous evening from an unknown number in which a woman's voice had suggested that the upcoming school board meeting could be a difficult experience for families with children currently enrolled. They called my wife, Eddie said, standing in his doorway with 71 years of Bakersfield behind him and an expression that had moved well past anger into something older and more implacable. At 8 o'clock at night, my wife is 68 years old and she's got a heart condition. He looked at Daniel. You tell me what I need to do to make sure that doesn't happen to anyone else. Show up Thursday, Daniel said. That's all. Just show up. I'll be there, Eddie said, and I'll bring my brother. He's got a big truck. Daniel drove back to the shop, called Ricky, called Voss, and spent the next 4 hours on the phone while Tommy handled the floor below, with the particular quiet competence of a young man who understood what was happening and had decided to be useful rather than intrusive. Voss's response to the attempted buyout was immediate and professional. Don't touch that recording without your attorney. It may be inadmissible, but it's absolutely relevant to the story. I want a transcript. She also told him something else. Gerald Whitfield made a call to my station manager this morning, she said. Daniel went very still. What kind of call? The kind where a man with real estate connections in Southern California mentions to a television station manager that he plays golf with 2 members of the station's board of directors. She said it flatly. And my manager called me into his office and said, with great diplomatic care, that he wanted to make sure our reporting on the Bakersfield story had adequate legal review before broadcast. Is that a problem? It would be a problem if I weren't already 3 steps ahead of it, Voss said. My reporting has been through legal review. My documentation trail is clean. And the call from Whitfield to my manager is now also part of the story, because my manager told me about it, and I'm documenting that he told me about it. They're making it worse every time they move, Daniel said. They don't know how to do anything else, Voss said. People who've operated this way for 20 years in a contained system don't have another gear. When the system stops protecting them, they do the same things louder. She paused. I want to move the broadcast date up. I was planning Sunday evening. I'd like to move to Thursday night, same night as the school board meeting. Thursday night. The board meeting is at 6. We broadcast at 10, which means whatever happens at that meeting, whatever they say, whatever they do, it airs 3 hours later alongside the full story. She let that settle. They won't know the broadcast is that night. My station's listings don't go public until 48 hours out. Daniel thought about the sequence of it. The board meeting at 6. Whatever Whitfield and his allies would say or do, the family standing in that room. And then 3 hours later, 10 o'clock, the full story going out to every television in the Central Valley and beyond. Do it, he said. I'll need you to be available by phone from 8 p.m. Thursday onward for any last-minute confirmation. I'll be available, and Daniel. Her voice shifted slightly. The story leads with Olivia. Not by name, she's a minor, but the cafeteria. Your description of what you saw. That's the opening. I want to make sure you're still comfortable with that. He thought about the cafeteria floor, his daughter's trembling hands. Her voice. Daddy, please don't get mad. I'm comfortable, he said. Okay, she said. Thursday. Wednesday was the day Gerald Whitfield himself called. Not through an attorney. Not through a community member messenger. Gerald Whitfield Jr. called Daniel Carter's cell phone at 2:17 in the afternoon while Daniel was in the shop bay looking at a fuel line issue on Big Joe's Road King. Daniel looked at the unknown number, thought about it for half a second, and answered. Carter, he said. A brief pause, the pause of a man who had expected to navigate a voicemail. Mr. Carter, this is Gerald Whitfield. The voice was baritone, smooth, the voice of someone who had run meetings and managed rooms for decades. Not hostile, almost warm, in the practiced way of men who use warmth as a management tool. I hope this isn't a bad time. It's fine, Daniel said. He moved out of the shop bay to the side office, where it was quieter. He did not tell Tommy anything. Tommy looked at his face and went back to the fuel line without a word. I want to speak to you man to man, Whitfield said. Without attorneys, without intermediaries. I think there's been a failure of communication at multiple levels here, and I'd like to understand your concerns directly. All right, Daniel said. I'm listening. What happened to your daughter should not have happened. I want to be clear about that. If there were incidents involving my son, and I understand, there may have been, those should have been addressed promptly by the school, and I take the failures of the school administration seriously. It was, Daniel thought, a very good opening. Calibrated perfectly. Acknowledgement without admission. Blame shifted laterally to the administration rather than to the source. Warmth maintained. I appreciate you saying that, Daniel said. I'm a father too, Whitfield continued. My son is 9 years old. He's had some difficulties. We've been working with him, with professionals, and I want you to know that we're taking this seriously as a family. What does taking it seriously look like? Daniel asked. We've engaged a behavioral specialist. We've had frank conversations with the school about expectations. We're committed to making sure nothing like this happens again. Since when? A slight pause. I'm sorry? Since when have you been doing those things? The behavioral specialist. The frank conversations with the school. Daniel kept his voice completely easy. Before I filed the records request. Or after. The pause was longer this time. Mr. Carter. I don't think the timeline is. I think the timeline matters quite a bit, Daniel said, pleasantly. Because if the specialist and the conversations happened after I started making noise, then what you're describing is a response to being caught. And if they happened before, then the question is why 4 families filed complaints over 2 years that resulted in no formal action. Whitfield's warmth didn't disappear, but it recalibrated. When he spoke again, his voice had shed one layer of the professional geniality and become something slightly more direct. I think we've both had experience with systems that don't always function the way they're designed to, he said. I'm not here to defend every decision that was made. I'm here because I believe that what's going to happen Thursday night is going to hurt a lot of people, children included, in ways that won't serve anyone's long-term interests. Thursday night, Daniel said carefully. The school board meeting. Yes, the meeting. The way Whitfield said it had a weight to it, the specific weight of someone who knows more than they're saying. These situations, when they become public spectacles, the children at the center of them don't always benefit from the attention. I'd hate to see your daughter's experience become content. He said the last word with a careful distaste. Content. Daniel sat very still. His hand was loose around the phone. Gerald Whitfield had just told him, without quite saying it, that he knew about Voss, possibly that he knew about Thursday night's broadcast. And he was using the possibility of Olivia's story being public as a pressure point, framing media exposure as something that could hurt her, that Daniel should want to avoid. He was using Olivia against him. Mr. Whitfield, Daniel said, and his voice now had a quality that was new to this conversation, quieter, slower, and with the particular weight of something that has stopped bothering to perform neutrality. I want you to understand something. Of course, my daughter has already been hurt. She's been hurt consistently for 6 weeks by your son. In a school building where the adults whose job was to protect her made a calculation that your family's money was worth more than her peace of mind. He stopped for one beat. The only thing that makes that hurt means something. The only thing that turns it into something other than just damage is if it prevents the same thing from happening to the next child and the one after that. He paused. Keeping it quiet doesn't protect my daughter. It just means her pain was free. Whitfield was quiet. I'm going to be at that meeting Thursday, Daniel said. The families are going to be there. And whatever happens after that, you should have thought about that before you let 4 complaints get buried. A silence that lasted 5 full seconds. I see, Whitfield said finally. The warmth was completely gone now. What was left was something else, not quite menace. but the particular cold quality of a man reorganizing his approach. I hope you've thought carefully about the implications of what you're doing. For your business, for your affiliations. There it was. My affiliations, Daniel said. The motorcycle club has a public profile that can be complicated. For the families involved in this, for the way the story is perceived. You're telling me, Daniel said, slowly and precisely, that you're going to try to make this about who I ride with instead of what happened to a 7-year-old girl on a cafeteria floor. No answer. Mr. Whitfield. Daniel's voice was the steadiest it had been in the entire conversation. I've been a member of this club for 17 years. In those 17 years, the men I ride with have shown up to funerals, to crises, to moments when other people looked away with more consistency and more basic human decency than most institutions I've dealt with. If you want to make this story about them, I'd encourage you to think very carefully about how that looks from the outside. Because right now, the story is about a wealthy family using its connections to protect a pattern of harm to children. If you add to that story the detail a same family then tried to use a man's community against him when he tried to protect his daughter, you haven't made the story better for yourself. Another silence. Think about it, Daniel said. Have a good evening. He hung up. He sat in the side office for a moment. Then he opened his phone's recording app, spoke the date, time, and the name Gerald Whitfield into it, and summarized the full conversation from the beginning while it was still exact in his mind. Then he sent an audio text to Ricky, to Marcus Webb, and to the attorney in Fresno. Then he went back out to the shop bay. Tommy was still working on the fuel line. He looked up once, registered Daniel's face, and looked back down. All good, he said, without inflecting it as a real question. Getting there, Daniel said. He picked up a wrench and worked beside his young mechanic for the rest of the afternoon, because some hours needed to be spent doing something real with your hands, something that had a right answer and a wrong answer and tools specifically designed for the purpose, and at the end of it, something worked that hadn't worked before. Thursday morning, Daniel drove Olivia to school. He did this every day. It was not unusual. But this morning, she was quieter than usual in the passenger seat, watching out the window with the particular inward attention of a child who was doing something privately in her head. You okay? He asked. Yeah, a pause. Is today a big day? He glanced at her. Why do you ask? You've been staying up late a lot. She looked at him with Emily's eyes, that direct, considered gaze. And you keep checking your phone and then putting it face down. You do that when something is happening. He thought about what to tell her. He had been careful, deliberate, measured about how much he shared with a 7-year-old who was already carrying more than she should. But she was also Emily's daughter, and Emily's daughter did not do well with managed truth. Today there's a school board meeting, he said. A lot of parents are going to be there. And some things that have been happening for a long time are going to get talked about in public for the first time. She absorbed this. About Preston, about how the school handled it. Preston is part of it. Are you going to say things? Yes. Are you going to be okay? The question landed exactly the way she meant it, not asking about his physical safety, asking about him, his feelings, his heart. The way she'd been asking that question in various forms, since she was old enough to understand that he had a heart that could be hurt. Yeah, baby, he said. I'm going to be okay. She looked at him for a moment longer, in that assessing way. Okay, she said, and then, can I have the window down? He put the window down. She stuck her hand out into the rushing air, the way she'd done since she was a toddler in a car seat. Fingers spread, feeling the resistance, and he drove the last 4 blocks to school, watching her in his peripheral vision, this small, serious person, this piece of Emily and himself in the world, who had sat on a cafeteria floor for weeks and chosen silence to protect him, and was now here, present, asking whether he was going to be okay. He pulled up in front of the school. She gathered her backpack, got 1 foot out the door, turned back. Daddy, yeah. Whatever happens today, it's good that you're doing it. She said it with a kind of grave certainty, the way a child says something they've been thinking about for a while and have arrived at as a conclusion rather than a feeling. Mom would think so too. He looked at his daughter. I know, he said. She got out. He watched her go through the doors, sat in the idling truck for a moment after the doors closed behind her. Then he drove to the shop because there were 6 hours until the meeting and they needed to be spent doing something useful. By 3 o'clock, things were moving fast. Ricky called to confirm that 37 chapter members were planning to attend the meeting. Not inside the room had a capacity limit, and Daniel had been clear that this was not a show of force. It was a show of presence, which was a meaningful distinction. They would be outside, on their bikes. Present and visible and absolutely not threatening, because threatening was the thing the Whitfields would want, the thing that would change the story's shape. Big Joe had been on the phone with 2 other chapters whose members had children in the district. 6 additional riders from Fresno and Visalia were making the drive. Not because anyone had organized a regional response, but because word had traveled the way word travels in communities built on loyalty, and because the story, when Joe told it in the plainest terms, which he was good at, had the quality of something that made people want to be present. Tommy called Rosa Mendez to confirm logistics. Rosa called Carmen Ibanez. Carmen called the Kowalskis. Marcus Webb had been in contact with Voss's producer all day, providing the final documentation she needed for the broadcast. At 4:15, Voss herself called Daniel. "We're locked," she said. "The piece is complete. Legal cleared it an hour ago. It runs at 10. Any movement from the Whitfield side?" Their attorney called the station again at 2 p.m. Asked to speak directly with my executive producer. Was told the producer was in a meeting. A pause that Daniel could hear her smiling through slightly. She was in a meeting. With me. Finalizing the broadcast. What are they going to do when they realize tonight is the night? They're going to realize it when everyone else does, Voss said. At 10 p.m. After the board meeting is over, she paused. How are you feeling? It was a real question. He recognized the difference. Like, I want it to be 6 o'clock, he said. That's good, she said. That means you've been building to something real. He got off the phone at 4:45 and spent 15 minutes in the shop bathroom, making sure he was presentable. Dark jeans, clean boots, the Hells Angels cut that he wore as a matter of who he was and not as a statement and not as a provocation. Though he understood it would read as both to some people and had made his peace with that. He was not going to be a different person to make his daughter's fight more palatable to the people who had hurt her. He was going exactly as himself. Ricky arrived at 5:15 to ride over with him. They stood in the parking lot for a moment, the 2 of them, in the early evening air that still held some warmth from the afternoon. Down the block, 2 other bikes from the chapter were parked outside the diner. Riders inside getting coffee, not leaving yet. Everyone had the timing. 6 o'clock, be present at 5:50. You ready? Ricky said. No, Daniel said. But I'm going. Ricky put a hand on his shoulder. Not the brief, functional touch Daniel used with Tommy. This was different, the grip of a man who had known him for 17 years and was choosing not to use words because some things don't need words. They rode. The Bakersfield Unified School District Board of Education met in a room designed for ordinary purposes, budget discussions, curriculum approvals, the administrative machinery of running a school system in a mid-sized desert city. Rows of plastic chairs bolted in shallow arcs facing a raised dais, a public comment microphone on a stand. When Daniel walked in at 5:52, 43 of the 60 available chairs were already filled. He recognized most of the faces, Rosa Mendez and Cora in the 3rd row. Carmen Ibanez with Sophia on her lap. The Kowalskis, both of them, with their son between them, the boy, who had stopped eating school lunch, who was 11 years old and sitting in that room with his parents, which was a kind of courage particular to childhood and all the more striking for it. Eddie Delgado in the back row with his brother, who had in fact driven a very large truck. Marcus Webb in the 2nd row with a folder on his lap that contained what he contained, and more. Faces Daniel didn't recognize had heard through the circuit of other parents who talk and had come not because they had documented incidents, but because something about the specific accumulation of this situation had made staying home feel like a choice they didn't want to make. Teachers. There were 3 teachers he didn't recognize seated near the left aisle, all of them with the careful, neutral expressions of people who were present at some professional cost and knew it. He sat in the second row. At the dais, the board members filed in at 6 p.m. exactly. 5 of them. Gerald Whitfield Jr. was not on this board. He sat on an advisory board, a distinction that had turned out to matter less than it should have because the superintendent who answered to this board had been in communication with Whitfield in ways that Webb's documentation made very clear. Superintendent Diane Abrams took her seat beside the board. She was 61, experienced, and she looked at the room and performed the calculation that people in her position perform, counting faces, assessing the composition of the audience, adjusting her internal model of how this evening was going to go. Daniel watched her do it, watched her eyes move across the room and land briefly, very briefly on his face, then on Ricky's in the row behind, then on the window where he knew. Even if she was calculating whether to register it through the glass, she could see the parking lot, and in the parking lot were the bikes. 37 of them, parked in 2 rows, riders standing beside them in the early evening, with the patience of people who have learned to wait in difficult conditions without becoming agitated. They were not inside. They were outside. They were present. Board Chairman Robert Ellis called the meeting to order. There were 2 standard agenda items. First, a budget amendment, a facilities update, and he moved through them with the efficiency of a man who understood that the room had not filled to this level for budget amendments. Then, public comment. "We have an unusually large public comment list this evening," Ellis said. He had a slightly damp quality about his manner, the quality of a man who had been told in the last 48 hours something that was making him uncomfortable. "We'll allow each speaker 2 minutes. I'm going to ask everyone to please observe, Mr. Chairman." The voice came from the third row. Rosa Mendez, standing, not waiting for the microphone to be passed. "With respect, 2 minutes is not enough time to describe 4 years of documented failure. I'd like to request a modification to the speaker limit, given the number of families who have experienced related situations." Ellis looked at her, looked at the room. "I understand the concern, Miss Mendez, Rosa Mendez. My daughter Cora is 8 years old. She was told by your school administration that she needed to work on her conflict resolution skills after being targeted for 6 weeks by the same child." She said it cleanly, without trembling, without apology. 2 minutes is what you give someone complaining about a parking ticket. Something moved through the room. Not loud, just a shift, collective and unmistakable. The sound of a lot of people deciding they were in the same place together. Ellis looked at the board members on either side of him, looked at Abrams. "We'll extend to 4 minutes per speaker," he said. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't enough. But it was a concession, and concessions in public meetings are recorded in minutes, and minutes are permanent. Daniel was the 7th speaker. He walked to the microphone with the folder that contained Olivia's incident records, the school's administrative correspondence, and Marcus Webb's summary, document the cover sheet of which Webb had organized specifically for exactly this moment, so that Daniel could place a copy on the board table and one in front of each board member before he began, which he did methodically while the room watched him. And the board members looked at the documents placed in front of them with varying degrees of composure. He stood at the microphone. He looked at the board, at Abrams. He thought about a Tuesday afternoon in October. A paper bag, a turkey and Swiss sandwich cut diagonally, a cafeteria door, a child on the floor. He thought about his daughter that morning, her hand out the car window, fingers spread in the rushing air, asking whether he was going to be okay. He took a breath. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said. "I'm a father. I have a 7-year-old daughter. And I am going to tell you exactly what I saw when I walked into this district school on October 14th, and exactly what I found out afterward, and exactly why none of us in this room tonight are leaving until this board makes a commitment on the record, in the minutes, before witnesses, that what happened to these children will be formally investigated, publicly reported, and permanently corrected." He looked at Gerald Whitfield's empty chair on the advisory board panel against the side wall. The chair was empty because Whitfield wasn't there. He'd known, somehow, that Whitfield wouldn't be there. That men who operated through proxies and attorneys and midnight calls and carefully worded warnings to parents and in golf games with television station, board members, men like that did not sit in rooms when the rooms stopped being controllable. They sent attorneys. They sent messengers. They did not sit in the room. Daniel turned back to the microphone and began. Every family that had asked him why he believed this would matter, every face in this room, every child who had come home from school and said nothing, he carried all of it. He spoke for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He went 18 seconds over, and nobody stopped him. When he finished, the room was so quiet, he could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Then Rosa Mendez started to clap, and it moved through the room like something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed. The applause lasted 40 seconds. Daniel counted it the same way he'd counted the 4 seconds in the cafeteria doorway, not out of vanity, but out of the habit of a man who tracks time, because time is the one thing that can't be manipulated after the fact. 40 seconds of a room full of people who had come in carrying something heavy, deciding, collectively and without coordination, that they were no longer going to carry it quietly. Then Robert Ellis called for order and the room settled, and the next speaker walked to the microphone, and then the next, and the evening continued, the way evenings continue even when something in them has shifted permanently. Carmen Ibanez spoke for 3 minutes and 50 seconds about Sophia and the letter from the district about conflict resolution skills. Her voice shook once, at the beginning, and then steadied, and she didn't look at her notes. The Kowalski father spoke about his son stopping eating lunch. He was a big man, heavyset, the kind of man who looked uncomfortable in public forums, and he spoke haltingly, without eloquence. And it was the most honest thing in the room. Eddie Delgado spoke last of the families, standing with the full weight of 71 years in this town, and the knowledge of exactly what this district owed his granddaughter and what it had paid instead. He spoke for exactly 4 minutes and did not go over. Marcus Webb approached the microphone and did not identify himself as a former district employee in his opening sentence. He introduced himself simply as a Bakersfield resident. He said he had documentation. He placed a second copy of his summary on the board table. He cited 3 specific email chains by date sender and subject line, not reading their content, just naming them precisely and without drama, letting the specificity do the work. The board member to Ellis's left a woman named Patricia Huang, who had been on the board for 2 years and had the quality of someone who had been uncomfortable for longer than 2 years, leaned forward and spoke quietly to Ellis. Daniel watched it happen from his seat. Watched Ellis receive whatever she said with the particular stillness of a man rapidly revising his assessment of his evening. When Webb finished and returned to his seat, Ellis said, "The board would like to take a brief recess." "No," said Rosa Mendez, from the third row, not loud, not aggressive, simply factual. "We've waited years. You can wait 12 more minutes while the remaining speakers finish." Ellis looked at her, looked at the room, looked at the window. Outside, the bikes were still there, still present, still patient. "Of course," Ellis said. "Please continue." 3 more parents spoke. 2 Daniel didn't know personally, one whose daughter was in Olivia's class and whose name he recognized from Rosa's list but had never confirmed. All 3 described variations of the same pattern: incident report, administrative letter, silence. Incident, report, administrative letter, silence. The machine documented and exposed. When the last speaker finished, it was 7:48 p.m. The meeting had run 1 hour and 48 minutes past its normal end time. Half the board had the expressions of people who had been somewhere safe and had just realized the geography had changed entirely. Ellis called the recess. It lasted 11 minutes. When the board returned, Patricia Huang was the one who spoke first, which Daniel noticed and filed. "The board would like to formally acknowledge the concerns raised tonight," she said, and her voice had a different quality than it had before the recess, something that had made a decision and was now in the business of executing it rather than managing uncertainty. We are placing on the record that we are commissioning an independent audit of all student conduct complaints filed with Emerson Elementary over the past 5 years. This audit will be conducted by an outside firm with no prior relationship with the district. The results will be made public. The room absorbed this. Additionally, Huang continued, the board is requesting a full accounting from the superintendent's office of all administrative responses to complaints in that period, including the internal communications that guided those responses. Abrams, seated at the end of the dais, had a very controlled expression. Daniel watched her hands, which were folded on the table in the deliberate way of someone making sure their hands don't move. This is a preliminary commitment, Ellis added, returning to his role as chairman with the slightly deflated air of a man who had lost the initiative in his own meeting. The specifics of the audit process will be Mr. Chairman. Daniel was on his feet. Will the board put that commitment in the minutes as a formal motion tonight? Not as a preliminary commitment, as a motion voted on, recorded. Ellis looked at him. Huang said, I'll move it. The board member to Ellis's right, a man named Davidson, who had said nothing all evening and had the tight expression of someone fighting a losing battle, internally seconded it. Ellis called the vote. 4 in favor. Davidson abstained. It passed. Daniel sat down. Rosa leaned over from 2 seats away and put her hand on his arm for 1 second. That was all. He looked at her, and she looked back, and there was an entire conversation in 60 seconds that required none of the words it would have taken to have it out loud. The meeting adjourned at 8:14 p.m. Outside, the air was cold and full, and the parking lot held the specific energy of people who had been in a room together, doing something hard, and were now standing in the open air, still connected by what they'd done. The riders from the chapter were still there. They hadn't moved, hadn't made noise, had been exactly what Daniel had asked them to be: present and patient and visible. A perimeter of solidarity that made no demands and offered no provocation, and communicated, simply by existing in that parking lot for 2 hours, that there was a community around these families that would not be eroded. Big Joe was leaning against his bike with his arms crossed when Daniel came out, and he looked at Daniel's face and said, motion passed, 4-1. Joe nodded. Once. The economical nod of a man who doesn't waste motion. Good. Ricky was at Daniel's shoulder almost immediately. Voss? I'll call her now. Daniel looked at the parking lot, at the 37 bikes, at the families coming out of the building behind him, moving differently than they'd moved going in, not lighter exactly, but more vertical, like something that had been pressing on their shoulders had shifted its angle. Carmen Ibanez came out with Sophia asleep against her shoulder, the child's head tucked in, and her mouth slightly open, completely unconscious through all of it. And Carmen looked at Daniel with red-rimmed eyes and said, she fell asleep during the third speaker. She had no idea, and something about that the child sleeping through the fight that was fought for her made Carmen's chin do the thing chins do, and she pressed her lips together and held it. She'll know later, Daniel said. That's what matters. Carmen nodded and walked to her car. Eddie Delgado stopped beside Daniel on his way to his brother's very large truck. He didn't say anything. He put his hand out. Daniel shook it. Eddie held the handshake for 1 extra beat and then let go and kept walking. Daniel called Voss at 8:21. Motion passed, he said. 4-1. It's in the minutes. A brief silence that had the quality of someone absorbing something they had worked toward and were now letting land. Okay, Voss said. We're on for 10. The piece leads with the cafeteria. The motion tonight will be in the closing segment. I'll do a live update from the studio at 10:50 after the piece airs. She paused. How's the room? How are the families? Changed, Daniel said. In the right direction. And you? He thought about that. I'll tell you after 10 o'clock. She understood. I'll talk to you tomorrow, she said. Good work. Daniel, he pocketed the phone. Ricky was beside him. 2 of the other riders had drifted close, not intentionally. Just the natural gravity of community. People moving toward each other after something significant. Nobody was speaking particularly. The night was cold and clear, and the parking lot lights had come on. Whitfield didn't show, one of the writers said. His name was Garrett Cruz, no relation to the vice principal, and he'd been in the chapter for 4 years and had a daughter in third grade at a different school and had driven here from the south side without being asked. No, Daniel said. He'll see it on television, Cruz said. Yes, Daniel said, he will. He picked Olivia up from Mrs. Patterson's house, the retired teacher 3 doors down, who watched her on evenings. Daniel couldn't be home at 9:15. Mrs. Patterson opened the door with the careful look of someone who wanted to ask and had decided not to. And Daniel gave her the brief nod that communicated things were okay. And she accepted that with the grace of a woman who understood that some evenings require digestion before they can be described. Olivia was awake, sitting on Mrs. Patterson's couch in her pajamas, with a book in her lap, the peculiarly alert wakefulness of a child who has been consciously waiting. She looked at his face the way she always looked at his face. Good? She asked. Good, he said. She closed the book, put on her shoes, said good night to Mrs. Patterson with the formal politeness she'd had since she was 4, and they walked home in the cold night air, her hand in his, the 3-block distance covered in a comfortable quiet that neither of them felt the need to fill. Inside, he made her hot chocolate, the real kind, milk on the stove, not the packet. And she sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in the quilt from the couch, and watched him make it with the particular focused pleasure of a child who enjoys the process as much as the result. He put the mug in front of her, sat down across from her. The board voted tonight to do a full investigation, he said, into everything that happened. At Emerson. To you, to Cora, to Sophia, to all the other kids. He kept his voice even and clear because she deserved clarity. It's going to take some time. There's going to be more that happens. But tonight, for the first time, the people who are supposed to be in charge said out loud, in a room full of people, that what happened was wrong and they're going to look at it properly. Olivia wrapped both hands around the mug. She was quiet for a moment. Did they say sorry? She asked. He thought about how to answer that. Not yet, he said. That might come later. Sometimes sorry comes after people have had to sit with what they did for a while. She considered this. Does Preston know? Not tonight. His family will know soon. Is he going to be in trouble? His parents are going to have to answer for some things. And I think someone is finally going to make sure Preston gets the kind of help that actually helps him. Not just protection from the consequences. He paused. Because a 9-year-old who does what he did isn't just a mean kid. He's a kid who learned something wrong somewhere, and nobody corrected it. That's not entirely his fault. Olivia thought about this with the profound seriousness of a child working through something genuinely complex. I still don't like him, she said. You don't have to like him, Daniel said. You just have to be okay yourself. I am okay, she said. And then, after a small pause, I'm more okay than I was. He looked at his daughter. Yeah, he said. Me too. She drank her hot chocolate. He sat with her while the kitchen clock moved toward 10. And when it was 5:02, he turned on the living room television, and she was already falling asleep against the couch cushion by the time Andrea Voss's broadcast opened. He watched it alone. It was 11 minutes long. It opened exactly where Voss had said it would, his voice, recorded in an interview 2 weeks ago, describing what he had seen when he walked through that cafeteria door. His voice was steady on the recording, measured, and hearing it back now. He was aware of the discipline it had taken to keep it that way, and he was aware that the discipline had been worth it because the steadiness made the content hit harder, not softer. A calm man describing something that made him furious was more devastating than a furious man describing it. The piece moved through the families. Rosa, Carmen, the Kowalskis. It showed the document's web summary, the buried complaints, the administrative correspondence that used careful language to manage families rather than protect children. It showed the school building. It showed empty chairs in an administrative office. It named the Whitfield family. It quoted the attorney's call to the station manager, verified by Voss's own manager on camera, speaking in the measured, careful way of an institutional man, describing something he had decided was important enough to say public. It ended with tonight's vote. Then Voss, live from the studio at 10:50, said, the Bakersfield Unified School District Board voted 4-1 tonight to commission an independent audit of student complaint records at Emerson Elementary. The Whitfield family's attorney declined to comment. Gerald Whitfield Jr. did not respond to requests for comment. Superintendent Diane Abrams issued a statement saying she welcomed the board's commitment to transparency and would cooperate fully with any review. Daniel looked at that last sentence, cooperate fully with any review. He thought about the email Webb had shown him, the one from Abrams's office 8 months ago, discussing the Mendez complaint and the family's limited escalation capacity. He thought about Harlow and her careful language and her legal warning at a records request meeting. He thought about the Mendez letter, the Kowalski boy who stopped eating lunch, the Ibanez daughter and her conflict resolution skills. Cooperate fully with any review. He turned off the television. Olivia was completely asleep, the quilt pulled up to her chin, her breathing slow and even. He lifted her carefully. She stirred but didn't wake, tucked her face against his neck with the trusting instinct of deep sleep and carried her to her bed, pulled the blanket over her, stood in the doorway. His phone had been vibrating for 15 minutes. He looked at it. Ricky, piece was clean. Voss did it right. Call me tomorrow. Rosa Mendez, I'm watching it. I'm crying. Thank you. Tommy Reyes, boss. Just saw the news. Holy sh... I'm proud of you. Marcus Webb, well done. Long time coming. Andrea Voss, well done, Daniel. Rest. More to come. He set the phone on the counter, looked at it for a moment. Then he poured what was left of the hot chocolate into a mug for himself, lukewarm now, still good, and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house and let the evening settle around him. The first thing that happened in the morning was his phone ringing at 6:40 with a number he recognized as the Fresno attorney's office. Have you seen the morning news? The attorney asked. I'm looking at it now, Daniel said, because his phone was in his hand and he'd been scrolling since 5:30. Gerald Whitfield Jr. had issued a public statement through Kale and Partners at midnight. The statement expressed concern for all students in the district, acknowledged that the school board's decision to conduct an audit was appropriate, and expressed the family's full commitment to cooperating with any review. It said nothing about the buried complaints. It said nothing about the pattern. It did not use the word accountability. It was, as public statements from people who have been exposed go, precisely calibrated to say as little as possible while appearing to say quite a lot. The attorney also filed a motion this morning, the Fresno lawyer said, in Fresno County Superior Court, requesting an injunction against any further broadcast of the piece on grounds of defamation and violation of the minor child's privacy. Daniel sat down. On what basis? The minor child's privacy claim is the stronger play. They're arguing that the broadcast identified Preston Whitfield in a way that constitutes harassment of a minor. A brief pause. It won't succeed. Voss's team named him as part of a matter of public record. The board meeting is public record, and the piece did not include any identifying details about the child himself beyond his family name. But the motion will cause a news cycle. They're buying time and creating noise. What do we do? Nothing. Right now. Voss's network legal team will respond. They have institutional resources the Whitfields can't match on defamation law, and they've already been through legal review. This is a pressure tactic, not a real legal threat. Another pause, but it's also a story. An injunction filed against a news broadcast the morning after the broadcast airs, filed by the family named in the broadcast, is news. Voss needs to know, Daniel said. She already knows. She called me at 6:15. I wanted to make sure you heard it from me first. He thanked the attorney, hung up, and called Ricky. They filed an injunction, Ricky said, before Daniel spoke. I know. Does it change anything? No, Daniel said. It makes it bigger. He thought about what Webb had said at the kitchen table all those weeks ago. The corruption isn't just in what they did. It's in what they do when they get caught doing it. They are being exactly who they are in public now. That's not our problem. That's their problem. The chapter wants to know if there's anything to do today. Nothing specific. Tell them to go to work, live their lives. He paused. And tell them I said thank you. For Thursday night. For the parking lot. For all of it. A beat of quiet. I'll tell them, Ricky said. They already know. He made breakfast. He was standing at the stove when Olivia came in, still in pajamas, hair in the particular morning disorder that had looked exactly the same since she was 2 years old. She stopped when she saw him at the stove. Pancakes, she said. Pancakes. She climbed onto the kitchen chair and watched him with the alert proprietorial interest of someone inspecting work being done on their behalf. Did something happen? You only make pancakes when something happened. The news story aired last night. About the school. About everything. He flipped the first one. People are talking about it. A lot of people? A lot of people. She was quiet for a moment, processing. Are they mad? Some are. At the right things, he slid the first pancake onto a plate. Some are sad. Some are, I think some people just needed to know they weren't the only ones who saw it. Saw what? That it wasn't fair, he said simply. What happened to you and Cora and Sophia and the other kids? Some people knew it wasn't fair, but they thought they were the only ones who thought so. When a lot of people find out they all think the same thing. Something changes. She put her chin in her hand and looked at the pancake with the thoughtful expression of someone integrating new information. Like when you said about the meeting, she said, that one family can be ignored, but a lot of family can't. Exactly like that. Okay, she said. She picked up her fork. Can I have maple syrup? He put the maple syrup in front of her, and she drowned the pancake with the totalizing commitment of a 7-year-old who has strong opinions about maple syrup ratios. And he sat across from her and drank his coffee. And outside the morning was bright and cold and indifferent and entirely ordinary. And inside the kitchen smelled like butter and warmth and the specific irreplaceable thing that is a parent and a child having breakfast together on a Friday morning when the world has just shifted slightly and they are both still here. The injunction was denied 6 days later. Fresno County Superior Court dismissed it in a ruling that used the phrase without merit twice and public interest 3 times. Voss called Daniel when the ruling came through, and her voice had the clean, satisfied quality of someone who had done something right and seen it verified. What happens now? Daniel asked. Now the network is interested in a follow-up piece, she said. There are 2 other districts in the Central Valley where similar patterns may exist. I've been contacted by families in both. If those stories develop, Bakersfield becomes the first in a series. She paused, which means what happened here matters beyond here. The way you knew it would. The way you knew it would, he said. I just knew it needed to. She accepted that distinction with a brief quiet. The audit timeline, she said. The independent firm is being selected next week. 30 to 60 days for the review. Results public. That's the commitment on the record. And Abrams? She's cooperating. As stated, whether cooperation leads to accountability is the next question. The board has the audit results when they come in. What they do with them is the test. I'll be at that meeting too, Daniel said. I know you will, she said. He was. The audit results came in 43 days after the board vote. The firm, a Sacramento-based education review company, with experience in exactly these kinds of institutional failure cases, produced a report that ran 112 pages and contained, among its findings, formal documentation of the following: 8 complaints about a single student improperly classified and archived without required parental notification, 3 instances of internal communication directing administrative staff to assess families by their follow-through capacity before determining response protocols, and a pattern of donor-adjacent conflict management that the report described in the careful language of formal audit as inconsistent with district policy and the equitable treatment of all students regardless of socioeconomic background. The report did not use the word corruption. Reports like this rarely do, but it describes something that had the same shape. The board meeting at which the results were presented was standing room only. Patricia Huang had prepared. She came in with the report tabbed and annotated and spoke for 40 minutes before opening the floor to board discussion. And what she said was clear and specific and left very little room for the ambient ambiguity that institutional processes usually use as cover. Diane Abrams resigned 2 days after that meeting. She issued a statement citing the desire to allow new leadership to implement the changes the audit recommended. She did not admit wrongdoing. The statement thanked the community and the board for their work. It used the word transparency 4 times. Daniel read it in his shop office on a Tuesday morning. He read it twice. Then he set his phone down and went back out to the floor where Tommy was working and thought about what accountability actually looks like when it comes not the clean cinematic version, not the gavel and the orange jumpsuit, but the real version, which is usually a resignation letter and 4 uses of the word transparency and a community that has to decide whether it's enough or whether enough requires something more. He thought about what enough meant. Margaret Harlow was placed on administrative leave pending the district's review of findings specifically related to Emerson Elementary. She was eventually transferred to a non-administrative district, a demotion in all but name, the kind that institutions give to avoid the messiness of formal termination when the documentation exists, but the appetite for full exposure is complicated. Preston Whitfield was quietly transferred to a private school in Fresno in December, a month after the board meeting. Gerald Whitfield Jr. resigned from the advisory board position in November, citing personal and professional commitments that preclude the time commitment the role deserves. He did not hold a press conference. He did not issue a statement about his son. He simply stepped back the way men with money and the option of stepping back sometimes do, into the quieter parts of their life. The Hells Angels chapter organized a toy drive through December. They set it up at Carver's and announced it through the community networks that had formed during the school board process, and families brought donations, and there were more donations than there were boxes for 3 days in a row, and Pete Carver had to go buy more boxes. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was a group of people who had been called on to be present and had shown up deciding to stay present in a different form, because showing up once is a gesture and showing up consistently is a community. Tommy Reyes organized the logistics of the toy drive with the same focused, quiet competence he brought to fuel lines and carburetor rebuilds. And when Daniel told him he was getting a raise effective immediately, Tommy said about time, with the particular combination of gratitude and performance of not being grateful. That is the specific language of young men who have not yet learned how to simply receive things they've earned. Rosa Mendez called Daniel in early December. Cora ate in the cafeteria today, she said, with 2 friends. I just wanted to tell you. He sat down on the stool in the shop office. That's good, Rosa. She told me she's not scared anymore. Not because nothing bad can happen, she said. Rosa's voice had the quality of someone reconstructing a sentence spoken by a child. Carefully, the way you handle something, you want to get exactly right. She said she's not scared because she knows now that if something happens, there are people who will do something about it. She said she knows the difference between adults who do something and adults who don't. A pause. She's 8. She's already figured that out. She had good teachers, Daniel said. She had a community, Rosa said. That's different from teachers. Teachers are assigned. Community is chosen. He thought about that for a long time after they hung up. Community is chosen. He thought about the parking lot on Thursday night. 37 bikes. The patience of men who had learned to wait in difficult conditions without becoming agitated. Riders from Fresno and Visalia who had driven to stand in a parking lot for 2 hours because the story had traveled through a network built on loyalty, and the story had the quality of something that made people want to be present. He thought about what his chapter had been, to him and to Olivia, since Emily died. Not a replacement for family, not a performance of brotherhood, but the specific practical thing that community actually is, which is people who show up, who answer on the first ring, who sit still while you talk, who stand in parking lots, who bring boxes when the boxes run out. Nobody had judged his daughter's pain by her father's cut. Nobody had weighed her 7-year-old dignity against the inconvenience of standing in a parking lot in the cold. They had just shown up. That was the whole thing. That was the entire thing. It was a Saturday in February when Olivia asked him to take her to the park. Not the school park, a different one. The one on the north side with the old oak trees and the wide flat grass, where she liked to bring her drawing pad and her colored pencils and spend a specific kind of time that was neither productive nor purposeless, but existed in the exact middle. Ground where children do their best internal work. He drove her there, sat on the bench while she spread out on the grass with her pad and her pencils. She drew for a long time. He drank coffee from the thermos he'd brought. The winter light was thin and clean, and the trees were bare, and the air had the particular quality of a February morning that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to be winter or the beginning of something else. After a while, she brought him the drawing. It was a parking lot. She had drawn it with the unself-conscious technical confidence of a child who draws constantly and has developed her own visual language, schematic and gestural, detail where it matters, suggestion everywhere else. The parking lot had rows of motorcycles, the school board building in the background, and in the front, small figures, a group of people standing together. "Is that the meeting?" he asked. "Yeah." She pointed to one of the figures, drawn slightly larger than the others, with dark hair and a jacket with something on the back that was her version of a patch. "That's you." He looked at himself in his daughter's drawing. The way she'd drawn the jacket, the way she'd placed the figure not in front, exactly, but at the edge of the group, where a person stands when they're part of something and also responsible for it at the same time. "And those are your guys," she said, pointing to the rows of bikes. "Our guys," he said. "They showed up for you." She looked at the drawing for a moment. "I want to give it to them," she said, to the chapter, "like framed or something, so they have it." He looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said, "we can do that." She took the drawing back, looked at it for another moment with the assessing quality of an artist reviewing completed work, and then put it carefully on top of her pad. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah. Do you think Mom knows about all of it?" He thought about a hospital room in winter, about hands held with both of hers, about the things she'd said she's soft-hearted, like me, watch for that, about a yellow sweater and a stain that had looked old, and a 7-year-old girl managing his feelings from across 6 weeks of silence. "I think she knew it was coming," he said. "I think that's why she told me to watch for it." Olivia considered this with the same seriousness she brought to everything. "Good," she said, like the word closed something. She went back to the grass, opened her pad to a fresh page, picked up a blue pencil. He sat on the bench and drank his coffee and watched his daughter draw, and the morning moved around them, indifferent and ordinary and entirely full of something he didn't have a word for but recognized as the thing you're supposed to be looking for. The thing that was there all along, the thing you almost missed because you were carrying something too heavy and too quietly and alone. He had not watched carefully enough, and then he had. And that was the difference between a story that ended in damage and a story that ended here a Saturday in February. Thin winter light, his daughter on the grass with a blue pencil, the drawing of the parking lot safe on top of her pad, 37 bikes worth of loyalty waiting to be framed and given to the people who had earned it. A father who had made a promise to a woman he loved. A daughter who had learned that her pain was worth fighting for. A community that had chosen to be exactly that, chosen deliberately in the face of every easier option. And a town that was not yet perfect, would never be perfect, but was no longer pretending that what happened to children on cafeteria floors was something too complicated to fix. That was enough. That was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.